All right, so I think all of you may have access to what we've put together as a training outline for today's session. And the good news is that all of this, basically, or not all of it, but the grand majority of this is going to be modified using that refund estimator page. We'll be doing all of this through here, with the exception of the submission of the return. That's really the only thing that we can't do at this point. But all this other stuff, we're going to go through it. So let me go back here, and let's start at the top. One of the things that we had to review is selecting the filing status. And here we are, number 1. You would choose whichever one is appropriate. I'll choose married filing jointly for this return. Enter in a taxpayer's date of birth. While I'm here, I'll also enter in a spouse's date of birth. And then you would check any of these other options that may apply for this particular taxpayer. These are overall kind of rare. Can this taxpayer be claimed as a dependent on another return? Well, if that's the case, you would mark that with a box, but mark that check mark. But in most cases, that's not going to be the case. Same thing with the ITIN, if they have to apply for an ITIN, or if the spouse is a dependent on someone else's return. So if those situations apply, you're welcome to select those. But if not, we can move forward. And then here we are in the dependents area, where you can start entering in some information about the dependents. Nothing detailed just yet, just the basic info. How many dependents? Let's say that they have 3 dependents. And then, again, depending on any other situations, if the dependent did not live with a taxpayer due to divorce, you can enter in how many children fit into that category, or other dependents that aren't included on these first 2 questions. Now, below that, since we are on the subject of dependents, we're talking about the child tax credit now. So, of these dependents that we entered in here, 3 of them, how many are under the age of 17? Because that most likely means that they can have this child tax credit. So I'll say that 2 of these 3 were under the age of 17. All right. Next stop, earned income credit. Number of children under the age of 19 at the end of 2015. Oh, and by the way, I am using the tax year 2015 multi-site online just for demonstration purposes, because we have all the forms here. The new software, which will be available as soon as tax season rolls around, that's still being built. Even though you have access to it at this point, the forms are still being built. So I think this will give us a more complete demonstration of the software. All right, so that's here. I'll enter in number 2 for that. And then I'll say that my 3rd dependent is a student. So I'll enter number 1 for that. And then it gives us the total amount of children eligible for EIC, for Earned Income Credit, 3. So that's looking good so far. We have the capability of adding the Form 8862 if there is information to be claimed for the EICF for disallowance. But again, some rare cases. If that's the case, simply marking with a checkbox will do. But if not, you can leave it blank and proceed forward. Child care credit. If there was any type of expenses for child care, typically associated with Form 2441, all right, you would enter in that amount there. Let's say that they spent $2,000 for that, and we'll say that one of the children is under the age of 13. There we are. Now income, wages for the W-2. Let's enter in some wages here. And notice that we have the area for the taxpayer, and we also have the area for the spouse. So depending on the situation, you would enter in where that info goes. I'll say that we'll do some kind of humble wages here, because I wanted to add that EIC. And there is a limitation as to how much the taxpayer can earn when it comes to that. So I'll enter in 20, and I'll say that they had a withholding of $3,500, a fairly large amount for that amount. And then the spouses, since we did want to talk about household help and how that process works, it's really simple. Let's say that we have she has a side business, very small, doing household help. We'll enter in that, withholding of 0 for that one. And then look at this box, check box. If any income above is household help, just mark that with a check mark, and that will take care of that. You'll notice, by the way, there are some areas as we go through this that have this more info button. So if you do need help with any of these areas, if you need a reminder of what these things mean, just click on this box, and it'll give you some additional information about any of the rules and the amounts that have to do with these areas. All right. Another thing that we wanted to take a look at are some Schedule C stuff. If they have a home business or anything like that, let's enter in some information about that. Let's say that the spouse has in regard to, she does household help, but she also has a little side business. Let's say like a child care business or something. I'll enter that she made $2,000 for the year of that as well. We're just entering the basics here. Later on, when we get into the body of the return, that's really where we're going to start entering the detailed information. But for now, we're just entering in income and the amounts. Something else that was on that outline, the training outline, IRA or pension distributions. So let's say that they've started to enter in amounts for retirement for an IRA. Let's enter in something here. Let's say $1,500 for that, and I'll enter in a withholding of, let's say, $350, just to enter something in there. Oh, and by the way, there are two areas where when it comes to the IRA or pension distributions, depending on the code used on that 1099-R, these amounts can be subject to a penalty, or they cannot, not subject to a penalty or subject to a penalty. And if you click on these more info buttons, it'll tell you, kind of give you a heads up about those codes. These codes that you see here are the ones that would not be subject to a penalty. And if I click on this one, these are the ones that are. So it gives you a heads up right away. If you have the 1099-R in front of you and you're not really sure whether or not, which one is which, if it's subject to penalties or not, you can review the code that's on that 1099-R and then just make sure that it matches with this one. Unemployment compensation. I'll enter in, let's say the taxpayer had an unemployment for a few months. Actually, let's do, that's not really realistic. Let's do at least $2,000 and a withholding of, let's say, I don't know, $50. But I apologize, some of these figures may be very wonky. Maybe this isn't really accurate to true to life, but at least it gives you an idea of where to enter the information, and we'll see how that flows into the actual tax return. Social Security income, another thing that we talked about, or that's on the outline. There it is right there. Most of the stuff that's on that outline we've kind of covered, and we're going to go through them all right on this main page. Speaking of which, taxpayer winnings, if they have a W-2G, if they earned winnings from gambling, this is where you can enter that information. Let's say the spouse gambled a little bit and she had some earnings, some winnings of $2,000 for that. And I'll say, the withholding, government always wants a piece of that, so I'll say $300, let's say, for that. All right. Another area that was on that outline are adjustments. Where do we go to make these adjustments? Well, here they are right now. If they have any educator expenses, any IRA contributions, all that stuff can be entered here for the tax return. Another thing that was mentioned on the outline are these itemized deductions. When it comes to itemized versus standard deductions, here's the area where you can enter in the itemized deductions specifically. They're listed out right here. And you also have the capability at the very bottom to check a box if you want to force itemized deductions. Otherwise, the program, if you leave this box blank, the program will determine which one is best for the taxpayer and spouse. It'll compare the standard deduction versus the itemized deductions and choose which one is best for the taxpayer, which one yields the best refund amount. So I typically recommend that you leave this one blank, and this little info button kind of breaks that down, kind of gives you some information about that as well, how the software likes to compare these two, all right? And it kind of gives you a heads up of what the standard deductions are. But again, I recommend leaving this blank unless, you know, the taxpayer really wants to use itemized deductions and they don't even want to take a look at what the standard deduction amounts would be. But I feel like that's a very rare case. So in most cases, you would leave this checkbox blank. Now let's say that they did, you know, enter in something here. Let's do some gifts to charity of $350. All right. Here we have some other areas for credits when it comes to the education credits, the American Opportunity Credit. Additional information can be seen by clicking on that button. If they are a student and paid some amounts for that. Let's go ahead and enter in something here. Let's say that they spent, I don't know, $1,000 just to enter in a nice, easy round number. And 401k contributions, another thing that was mentioned on the outline. How do we go about doing that? Well, here it is right here on line 29. You would review, you know, the W-2 to see if they have 401k contributions. And let's say that this taxpayer, you know, they're diversifying their retirement. They've got an IRA and a 401k. So let's say that, yeah, they drop some money for that as well in there. Here we have some miscellaneous taxes that may apply, lines 31 and 38. If those situations do apply for the taxpayer, you could enter in those amounts here. But if not, just proceed forward. And here is the state return, another aspect that was in the training outline. How do we go ahead and add these states? Very simple. The first box has to do with the resident state. So this is like if they're a resident of a particular state and have state withholding, you would choose that state. I'll choose Georgia for this example. But if they do work at a different state, but they're not a resident of that state, this is where you can add as many non-resident states as you need. They're all included on this list. You would just choose the particular state and then click on this little arrow to move it over here to the right. Any state that appears over here to the right will be added to the tax return, to the actual body of the return. So I'll leave that there just so we can see what that looks like. And then at the bottom, we have this list here of forms that can be added to the return at this point. You know, these ones, it says right here basically that due to the complexity of these forms, there really isn't a way to add this to the estimate, to create an estimate based on the income or the information on these forms. So we essentially give you a list, and depending on the taxpayer's needs, you would simply just mark the box to add that to the tax return. And it's not that long of a list, as you can see. So hopefully, and when it comes to your basic tax return, you know, most of this stuff is going to be covered using the sections that we've reviewed, going down this list up here. But if there are a little bit more complicated returns and they have a specific form that we need to use, well, here's the rest of the forms available to us so that we can select and then move forward.